is not to say that something could not be done with this, but to simply ignore that the structures surrounding it are out of brick. You know, proposing something with the lower portion in brick or stone certainly would have been at least a nod to that historic character. Also something a little bit smaller in scale rather than, you know, roughly 20 feet higher than everything else immediately adjacent does change the feel of the neighborhood. And again, this is something that I personally and professionally have felt and can testify to, that the HPC did it right in considering this. There is no need for a variance if the owner decides to do nothing right now. He is imposing this hardship on himself by this proposal. I mean, there is no need for a variance currently. And posing that this drive that cuts through it, they are also changing the drive to the point that it benefits only one portion of the site to the detriment of the Effie Day house, and also cutting into the street with an additional curb cut that quite oddly would put on that side of the street 3 large driveways directly adjacent. So, and it impacts an area where parking is at a premium. People do drive cars. People need to store them somewhere. Being that, yes, zoning requirements have changed to the point where it is no longer necessary to provide them. And as historically they pointed out, there had been a house there on this lot too. There had been no garage.
Thank you.
With that, if there's any questions, I would certainly welcome to respond.
Okay,
Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Next speaker, come on up.
Hello, my name is Jane Dietrich, and I live at 1821 DuPont Avenue South. I'm just around the corner from this from the Day House, and our house was built in 1899, and the beautiful house at 1900 Colfax. Since if we wouldn't be talking about it if the owner would have been allowed to tear it down and build an apartment house there in 1910 or before that. So we're happy to have that house. We drive down Colfax and you see this beautiful house, and it's reminiscent of all the other beautiful houses in the neighborhood. And one of the nice things that's happened since we bought our house in 1992 is that people have taken more pride in their houses, I think, at least in that part of Lowry Hill, and they've improved their houses and their taxes have gone up, so that's good, and for the city or for the county. And anyway, we do take pride, and I think that this development would be a blight on the neighborhood. It doesn't fit in. The existing house is beautiful and has a lot of tenants already. And one of the things that is of concern to me is that the block is extremely congested on Colfax. There's nowhere to park in Colfax. And parking is restricted. Excuse me. Trucks and vans often block the street while unloading goods for the restaurants. And street parking is not only limited on Colfax, but also on Lincoln and on DuPont. It is often difficult for visitors to my home to find a place to park. The driveway to 1900 Colfax exits on Lincoln across from my backyard and will probably be used as an entrance exit from the new building, which means that Lincoln will be even busier than it is now. And visitors to that new building will be looking for a place to park on the street. For example, yesterday, I went out and counted the cars that were parked on Lincoln between DuPont and Colfax, and there were 11 cars parked there at 4 p.m. in the afternoon. To me, this is an outrageous proposal by owners who care nothing about our neighborhood and only care about the amount of money they can squeeze from their house at 1900 Colfax. Why should we allow a developer from another city to diminish our neighborhood? Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak?
Pardon me?
Would anyone else like to speak? No problem.
Can I use the visual aid?
Yep. You can just put the items on the screen there, and then they
Just
should
put it
appear.
on there?
Yep.
Okay.
And then just a reminder for folks who are speaking to please check in with the clerk to so we get your information.
I have a couple to show you. Pictures are usually helpful. My name is Tony DeRamo. I am a resident of 1920 Colfax Avenue South. I'm just down the street. I'm a 26-year resident of Lowry Hill, a property owner, and a Lowry Hill Neighborhood Association board member. I'm not speaking for the board today, but I am a member. I asked the committee to deny the appeal to build the 4-story apartment building in the side yard of 1900 Colfax. The 1900 block of Colfax Avenue South serves as a gateway and a buffer to historic Lowry Hill. Over the years, the block has been abused by teardowns and constructions of structures inappropriate and incongruous in both look and feel for this treasured old city neighborhood. I ask the committee deny the appeal. The HPC decision noted the specific pointed language in the historic designation that covered the house and the full lot. The designation says, this was from the conversations at the HPC meeting. The designation says the entire property, every map shows both lots. This would alter the feeling of the house, the present day ability to convey the past. The lot is important to that. Whether or not we should question any building on the lot is appropriate. The commission had asked the applicant for some reconsiderations, which he ignored. The setbacks, I'm not certain that they are compliant. When you look at the protrusion of the balconies, they are inside the regular variances that they were talking about. The building to the south is closer to the sidewalk, but to me, a mistake from the past should not beget a mistake for the future. The easement with the driveway, this shared drive which crosses through the historic property, dividing the house from a garage behind it, devalues the historic property. It is unfortunate and unnecessary. It is a burden for any future property owner. This is not, it's not similar to a shared driveway that we see sometimes with single-family homes in the neighborhood. With apartment buildings, 7 units in one, 5 units in the other, there is a lot more traffic and noise that would be going behind the house. The easement causes undue burden on the historic property. Parking issues will be exacerbated. The 1900 block of Colfax is a densely populated block, and it struggles massively with parking and traffic right now. And then although the parking requirements are technically fulfilled, and I understand the density things that the city is wanting to do, there's still a qualitative matter to consider. In practical use, not only will the design add new vehicles to the street from new residents, it will displace parking of the current tenants living in the 7 units in the apartment building, moving their cars to the street. This block has always been full of vehicles, and because of the density of the apartment buildings there. But in the last 2 years, the opening of 3 restaurants on the block, the Birch, Bradstreet, and Lowry Hill Meats, has added to the problem, and it now spills on to the other blocks as well. The Lowry Hill Neighborhood Association was not approached at all by the applicant. I cannot officially speak for the association, but I can say it is disappointing that the applicant did not make any effort to contact or converse with the neighborhood in this way.
If I can ask some final thoughts, and then we need to keep the meeting.
Yes, I understand, but they got a chance to speak, so we should get a chance to speak. But there was also a mention of what is down the street. This is the Effie Day house. This is another house that has apartments in it. They spoke of the high-rise to the south, but as you can see, that new building would be like up here and really change the streetscape. This is an example of some of the other buildings on the street. This is the one that I was speaking of that was kind of the mistake from the past. The other ones, you can see the roof lines are very different from the proposed building. They're more like the So in conclusion, I just would like to summarize by saying the purpose of zoning is a simple one: to separate incompatible uses. In some ways, zoning does constitute a taking since it can limit a property's economic value. But in Euclid versus Amber Realty, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1926 upheld the concept, saying that zoning was a reasonable exercise of a city's police powers. I ask the committee agree that this is not a good fit and deny the appeal. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? Anyone else? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing. I'll see if there's any questions for staff or Councilmember Wright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just note that, a lot of conversation has been around compatibility with the overall neighborhood and certain contributing factors at that sort of expanded review. But my understanding, based on what I've heard from testimony and our legal advice, is that we're really anchoring it to the specific designated property and compatibility with that. And with that, I think staff's evaluation of the failing to meet that criteria is pretty clear, and I would contend it's consistent.
Thank you, Councilmember Wright. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is an interesting case and one I've been involved in for a long period of time. I think both sides make a lot of really good points, and I'm going to try to thread the needle here on what I think makes the most sense based on the city's overall point of view with regard to preservation as well as building and density. So I am going to move, and then I'll explain, that we approve the certificate of appropriateness, subject to the condition that the height of the new building will not exceed the peak of the roof of the day house. In addition to that, it should be consistent with the materials, color, style, and setbacks of the day house specifically. And that the review of the new proposal, if there is one, shall be sent back to the Heritage Preservation Commission for review, unless Mr. Nilsson would like us to take that up instead of the HPC. I'll defer to Mr. Nilsson.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Goodman, with the conditions of approval being as they are, that it could substantially affect the proposal, I think the proper path would be to go back to the HPC.
Okay, then, Madam Chair, I would note that it would go back to the HPC for review, and I'd like to speak to that motion.
I apologize. This action today would go to the full council. You are approving new construction, but then a subsequent proposal would have to go back to the HPC. Again, the certificate of appropriateness application is subject to the 60-day law as well.
Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is I think it's legitimate that something be built, but I don't think what's proposed is legitimate. And I don't think that something that towers over the day house makes any sense. And I think the style of the house in terms of its design, materials, setbacks need to be taken into further consideration. I believe we have the right under the law to do so because the building, the designation is legally described as lots 1 and 2, and if there were no individual findings with regard to the lot, then we go back to the Secretary of Interior standards, and the Secretary of Interior is clear that the standards need to be, the building needs to have features of scale, size, and proportion and massing to protect the integrity of the property designated. So I think it's really important to have this be compatible with the house next door while allowing something to be built. I realize that there is a concern about parking and there's a concern about traffic and congestion, but we've already crossed that hurdle. We made a decision as a council to say that we think building on empty lots within the realm of compatibility is legitimate, and if you're very close to a transit station, you shouldn't have a parking requirement. And I supported that, and I still do. I do think it's good that there are parking spots available for the day house. I'll note that should any development come forward, the applicant would be required to come back to us for a variance that would a lot area variance that would determine whether or not you would have to reduce the number of units in the day house from 7 to 5, and that in and of itself could reduce the parking by having less people living in the day house. And with a building that is smaller in size and scale and height, there might be less people living there as well, which could potentially make the situation with parking better as well. I think within this, I would move to approve the historic variance to maintain the existing setbacks from the interior property line of the day house located at 1900 Colfax as well. So essentially, we're saying if you can come up with a design that meets the Secretary of Interior standards and doesn't exceed the height of the day house, it's something the Heritage Preservation Commission should consider. And should you then move forward with a building of this project and a lot split, you'd have to come back to us to get a variance to keep the number of units in the day house at 7, rather than what the zoning allows at 5.
Okay, so Councilmember Goodman has moved to grant the appeal for the certificate of appropriateness, including several conditions, which we'll make sure that we get in writing to the clerk. Did anyone write them down as Councilmember Goodman was speaking?
Madam Chair, I'm happy to work with the clerk after.
Perfect.
I have some notes that I took during the testimony, so I can provide those notes.
Excellent. And then as well as granting the appeal for the historic variance of the setback. Mr. Nielsen, I wanted to clarify, though, that one of the conditions was for further review of the revised design by the HPC, and you're saying that there is not time for that step to occur?
We could consult with staff. I think that's unlikely, Chair Bender. One of the things I think that the motion makes clear that the committee, should it approve the motion, is in favor of new construction, just that it hews closer to the Secretary of the Interior's guidelines according to this designated double lot and the landmark structure. So I think the potential review here, because it is a review that the HBC has not had the opportunity to have of that proposal, could be perhaps in just a sort of a committee of the whole format with the HBC, not a reformal application, because the council does have to take final action on this application, which requires action by the full council and mayor's signature.
Okay. All right. And are we expecting that we would be able to have the new design by the time that the council votes, or we're just relying on our conditions to guide that final design, and we would then rely on staff to make sure that the conditions have been met?
Yes, that's correct. In past precedent where conditions are imposed related to design, we do often provide the authority with staff to ensure that those conditions are being complied with. In similar fashion here, I think there's a desire to have the HBC just look at this because they have not had that opportunity. Again, that could be done in sort of an informal format through a committee of the whole type scenario.
Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Nielsen, I want to make sure there's some level of review because we have mentioned to the applicant multiple times that making the building smaller and making it more consistent with the character of the neighborhood is something that we potentially could support once all the facts were heard, and they've refused to do it multiple times. And they didn't even go to the neighborhood association and ask for their opinion. So how am I to trust that anything would come back that would be acceptable?
Yep. Chair Bender, Councilmember Gooden, at some level, I would hope that the council would have faith in their professional planning staff, that there are staff that are familiar with the regulations and the Secretary of the Interior standards, and that should a new proposal be forthcoming, that you would have faith that staff could review that to ensure that it is compatible with those guidelines. That regardless, the conditions that you've suggested would have to be complied with in order to get us to get the certificate of appropriateness, to move on to the next phase of zoning review, to get the building permit. So the conditions are there. They would have to be complied with. It's just a matter of ensuring that they're complied with. I would suggest that staff has the ability to do that. If you would like additional review by the HBC, I think that I do think that makes some sense. But in terms of where we are at with the procedural posture today, I think that would have to occur in some sort of informal format, and not a whole new application process, which just effectively means we haven't taken final action today.
Given that, I guess I would suggest that then we need to make sure that the conditions are very clear and achieving what guidance we need to give to staff and the applicant.
And
Councilmember Goodman.
And in that vein too, I have staff direction to draft findings, which would incorporate those conditions would be good, and I would advise doing that.
So what I was going to note is that I would be moving also to ask staff to draft findings and clarifying in my motion to the clerk all of the items. I mean, like this front yard setback issue of the porch being further forward, These are all issues that should come back to us for final findings prior to the council meeting for committee of the whole, actually, next Wednesday. So my office will be very active in making sure the spirit of some of these design changes are written out so that staff will know exactly what we meant when reviewing any future application.
I don't want to derail this, the details of this conversation. I could just throw out another option would be to forward without recommendation for now. And okay, just want to make sure you're comfortable with the conditions as they stand. Okay, so then on Councilmember Goodman's motion to grant the appeal of the certificate of appropriateness with several conditions related to fitting in with the historic designation of the entire lot, as well as granting the appeal of the setback variance. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in approval, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That carries. I will note that that included a staff direction to prepare findings. So that moves us to item number 2, which is a certificate of nonconforming use appeal. I will note that I need to leave by 11:15. So we will lose quorum at that time. So we need to finish this item by 11:15. That should be plenty of time. I don't see a lot of people signed in for this item, but I will need to make sure that everyone stays within the time that's been allotted for this item. And we'll make sure everyone has time to speak. Thanks.
All right. Good morning. So the appeal that's before you is an appeal of the Board of Adjustment decision to deny a certificate of nonconforming use to establish legal nonconforming rights for a used car dealership located at the properties of 2636 to 2638 West Broadway. The appeal applicant is Justin Ebel. He is a relative of the property owner. The original applicant, just for reference, was State Auto Corporation. They would be leasing the property. The current zoning is OR2. It does not allow for any kind of auto sales in that zoning district. On this site, used auto sales have been established since the 1990s, and that was when the zoning did allow for car sales. Just to familiarize you with the site a little bit, so West Broadway is down here. There's an existing office building, a canopy structure, a detached garage, and some parking and sales area on the site. So under the zoning code with nonconforming uses, several conditions apply. First, legal nonconforming uses and structures are allowed to continue so long as they remain otherwise lawful. If a nonconforming use is discontinued for a continuous period of more than a year, it is deemed to be abandoned and may not thereafter be reestablished or resumed. And finally, any subsequent use of the land or structure must then conform to the requirements of the district that's located in. So both CPED staff and the Board of Adjustment found that the use had not remained lawfully established, and that was because the city license had not been obtained for a car dealership on the site within 5 years from now, or in the previous 5 years from now, and therefore those non-conforming rights had been lost. So as I mentioned, auto sales have occurred on the site since the 1990s, so I'll just go through the zoning history a bit more. It was first zoned B3S, and as I indicated, that zoning did allow for auto sales of used cars. Then in 1999, when our updated zoning code was adopted, that zoning changed to C2, and that zoning still allowed for auto sales, but it limited it to new and vintage vehicles. A rezoning study then later occurred in 2003, which again changed the zoning to C1, where no car sales are allowed. And then another rezoning study occurred in 2009, and that's where we got our current zoning of OR2, where no car sales are still allowed. So the used car sales became non-conforming as of 1999. In addition to zoning requirements, there's also licensing requirements, and those come from the city and the state. So in the city, all motor vehicle dealers are required to be licensed. That license is tied specifically to a site, and we have had no active city licenses on the site from 2011. That last license was held by the property owner. We do know that from records that we have that the site has been used for car dealers by car dealers since 2011, even though there hasn't been a city license in effect. Records submitted by the applicant indicate that the dealers that were using the site did have state licenses. So during this time, city enforcement records show that attempts were made to notify the users of the site that a city license was required or needed to be obtained. In 2013, licensing had sent a notice to that dealer at that time that a license was required. That dealer came into the zoning office, we know, met with zoning staff. They were told that non-conforming rights had been lost because it had been 2 years since the last city license had been obtained. And then they did identify what options they had to rebut abandonment and retain non-conforming rights, but no action had been taken at that time. So then in 2014, licensing had sent the property owner a citation because the used car use had continued to operate. Again, no action had been taken to address the non-conforming issue. And then the last record we have is from this year, where our zoning office had sent a notice of non-compliance to the owner. So to address non-conforming issues and rebut abandonment, the applicant has to bear the burden of proof to illustrate clear and convincing evidence that the use of the property for the non-conforming use that's operating was not discontinued for more than 1 year and has remained otherwise lawful since 1999. With no city license being obtained since 2011, and that there were, and that the previous dealers and owners were made aware of these requirements, it was determined that auto sales have not been lawfully established since 2011. So that's the period, that's the issue, where they have to prove that they have not abandoned the use for the last 5 years. But the board concluded that the applicant failed to present clear and convincing evidence that the use of the property is illegal non-conforming use for the sale of used automobiles. So that's where it concluded. I can take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Whitmire. Just clarifying, OR2 allows for auto sales, but not used auto sales. Is that correct? Is that what you said?
It allows for no auto sales
No auto sales.
whatsoever.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for staff? Okay, there are none. So I will open the public hearing. I assume the person who signed in is from the applicant, Justin Ebel. Come on up, please. I'll ask you to keep your remarks to 10 minutes. Should be plenty of time.
I'm here today to speak about the property at 2638 West Broadway. I put a map up to show that to the south is a gas station, to the north is a daycare. Our property has one way in, one way out. I just wanted to add to Ms. Whitmire's statement that I did not receive any of the letters. The letters were all sent to the address, so they were sent to the occupant that was renting from me. And until this last one, when we were actually there, we received the letter and did comply with that to fix it. I sent a letter to Vince Auto Group, who was the last occupant, a certified letter stating that I wanted to see his dealer's license, bond, city license, and insurance to make sure that he was compliant. And I did not receive anything from him, so then I did, I got him out of there. I did evict him. To have a dealer's license down there, there must be this paper signed by the zoning office to allow that. And in order to get a dealer's license down there, and that had to have been signed for the state to allow that license to go down there. Therefore, I was not aware that there was not obviously city licensing down there. That's about all I have today. I just asked for your help today to let us continue on with this. And one thing I'd like to add, there is a car lot down the street operating with a dealer's license that's 1 block down the street from it. So on the same street, obviously.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for your time.
And you own the building, but not the business. Is that correct?
Yeah, my father owns a building. I've taken over for him because he's a vulnerable adult. So.
Thank you. Okay.
All right.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank
Would
you.
anyone else like to speak? Come on up.
I've been there like 25 years, and if you didn't want to give somebody else a license, I guess I'd try to go back. I don't know what else I would. That property was for my retirement.
Sir,
And
could you
I would-
give us your name, please? And then,
Oh, I'm Dale Ebel,
okay,
property owner
gotcha. Thank you.
of 2638 West Broadway. And when I was there, I had good. I mean, when I go down there now, they still honk the horn. Yeah, my dad bought a car from you. You know. So I mean, I do like it down there, but I'm getting older and out of shape kind of now. But I don't know. We didn't know about the license. The city not getting paid, but they were getting signed by the zoning for that. So we just figured everything was okay. Now, the guy that was in there last, I don't like saying it on tape, but the truth's the truth. He wasn't too good. He was a bad guy. And once we found out, I even called the gal at the city and I said, hey, I got a bad guy, I think, down there. How do I get him out? And they said, well, he's not a bad guy. So, I mean, I really did. And that's all I can say. I just wanted to at least give you my part of it. I served my time in the service, and I come back and I had a restaurant in Emerson and Lowry. It started out in 1972, so I kind of stayed around the area. Nobody knows me hardly. I did help the Jordan area years ago. I was on a committee when I was a little bit quicker, and we got the policemen on bikes and stuff like that. But then I went on and, raising the kids. So that's it. I guess I got to state something. Back.
Thank you, sir. Would anyone else like to speak? Anyone else? Okay, no problem. Seeing none, I will then close the public hearing. Council President.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a difficult one, but I think one of the most frustrating parts about it is that, we have 2 years where we had no city license, and there apparently was no or very little follow-up for that on our part. But I'm going to move to deny the application. I think this is a change. The zoning changes that were recommended by the West Broadway Alive plan are good changes, and we have to respect the work that was done around that process. This is next, as was pointed out, is next door to a gas station, but on the other side of it is the Lau Community Center, which is a really great use for that property, which used to be a funeral home when I was a kid. So I think we're seeing changes on West Broadway, and I think we have to respect the planning process that people put in place, or the work that the planning process produced. So I'm going to move to deny the appeal.
Thank you for the motion. Is there any discussion? I think I would say, staff did a very thorough job, I think, of documenting the legal context with which we have to make the decision, which was that the business wasn't operating legally. I would offer to the property owners that Ms. Widmeyer could help connect you with staff in CPED that is, could let you know what uses are allowed under the zoning. And there may be some resources available to you from the city to understand what are the options going forward for use of this property. And I hope that the city can provide some support for that. And it would likely not be planners within Ms. Widmeyer's section, but another section of CPED. Our long-range planners or our economic development planners, I think, could be helpful to you. So with that, is there any further discussion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That carries. We are adjourned.
Thanks for that.